Hello, my name's Stuart. I'm the unrepentant atheist, and today what I'm going to be talking about is evidence, or rather, uh, what constitutes good evidence. Now, we're always talking about evidence, we're always talking about assessing evidence, and we're hearing evidence when claims are being made. In particular, we're hearing evidence presented by, shall we say, Christians and theists um, supporting the proposition for theism, the proposition that a God or gods exist. And it's always baffled me that people have got different ways of assessing how strong evidence is. I've often heard it from Christians that what we should be doing as atheists and what Christians are doing is taking uh, a collection of evidence and adding it all together, and from there deciding whether the proposition is likely to be true. Now, this may be a case where if we say that if we rate evidence, let's say on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very weak, 5 being strong and virtually conclusive, that if you've got, shall we say, 3 dozen pieces of evidence with an average rating of 2, and no single piece of evidence is worth more than 3, what Christians seem to be saying is that if you add them all up, it's going to be the equivalent of one piece of evidence, or maybe more than one piece of evidence, that is worth 4 or 5, and therefore conclusive. I think that's erroneous. I think it's false, and I don't think it's properly rational, because um, in order to prove a proposition, you only need one piece of evidence. Let me give you an example. I don't know whether this is a good example, but the proposition, for example, that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. Now, there's nothing unusual about this proposition. It's quite common. It's an established fact. But let's say that we want to test it, because hearing the proposition, what evidence have we got? Okay, we've got books, and we've got claims of scientists, physicists, and chemists that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. Fortunately, we don't have to take their word for it. So we only need one piece of evidence to prove this. And let's say that the evidence in books is, in our opinion, inadequate. In the same way that I'm saying as an atheist that all the claims in the Bible are inadequate as any kind of evidence for those claims. We need to test. We need one piece of evidence to prove the proposition. Just one. We don't need dozens of weak examples worth 2 and 3 out of 5. No, we need one example worth 5 out of 5. So with the water example, in order to prove the proposition, we need some way of testing it, and it's quite simple. We take a pan of water, we bring it to the boil on the oven or cooker, and we've got an instrument whereby we can measure water temperature called a thermometer. So we use our thermometer. When the water starts boiling, we put the thermometer into the water, and we wait a minute, and then we read off the temperature. And if the temperature reads 100, we can be fairly sure, we probably can't be certain, but we can be fairly sure that the proposition that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade is more or less proven. One thermometer. Of course, you can say that that thermometer is faulty. Okay. Let's take a second thermometer bought from another shop, from another batch, not from the same batch, because of course we may have a factory that produced nothing but faulty thermometers. Let's buy another thermometer from another factory, and let's repeat the experiment with another thermometer and test it out. Yes, it's 100 again. So we've reduced the probability by repeating the experiment with another thermometer that the experiment is faulty. So we try a second thermometer, and the probability that we've got a false result, that we haven't proven the proposition that water boils 100%, the probability that it's faulty is actually reduced. And then we can go on trying different thermometers, and eventually we will get to a stage where we've tried so many that to believe, if they keep 100 degrees, if every single experiment reveals 100 degrees centigrade, thermometers from different factories all over the world, the more times we repeat the experiment and the more successes that we have with no failures, we're getting almost to a degree of certainty that the proposition is true. We may never be able to get to absolute certainty, but in order to believe that the proposition is false, we would have to accept something which is incredibly implausible and improbable, namely that all of these thermometers from different factories are actually not giving correct readings. So this is why I'm saying that a collection of evidences which are mediocre and weak or even average in no way is going to prove a proposition, no matter how many of them you've got. So I think we can debunk that what Christians have got to do, and what anybody's got to do that wants to prove a proposition, is present, I'm not going to say good evidence, because in fact I've looked up the definition of the word evidence, and I've got a definition here taken from the internet dictionary on Google. So definition of evidence: fact or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true and valid. I like that definition. Now that means that evidence is simply evidence. Evidence is necessarily good evidence, and that bad evidence is no evidence at all. So there's no such thing as good evidence. There's only evidence. So when a Christian comes to me and presents me with, shall we say, evidence for the resurrection, and the evidence is the Bible, or the evidence is what they think in the story, or stories that have been passed down unconfirmed, that various self-sacrifices of Christians who've gone to their deaths believing that Jesus was really resurrected. That's not evidence. You could call it bad evidence, but no, it's not bad evidence. It's just not evidence, because all we've got are stories, and we've got no way of confirming them. So it's not evidence at all. They're just stories. And coming back to we need criteria. So we need criteria to decide what is evidence and what isn't. And I've just written down one or two things here. Maybe you can add to these to help me out, because I really think that if Christians and atheists could agree on a set of criteria for what constitutes evidence, then maybe we could stop hearing erroneous claims based on what people think is evidence, but in reality isn't evidence at all. And if we could stop Christians and theists from using these so-called evidences, false evidence, and just banish them once and for all, debunk the whole lot of them, and get Christians to admit that this is not evidence, maybe then they would go out and try and find something new which really is evidence. So just coming back to my criteria, I think that if something is going to be considered evidence, and this is really particularly getting at supernatural claims and religious claims, the evidence has got to be consistent with what is universally accepted demonstrable reality. So this would necessarily rule out supernatural claims, so-called supernatural evidence, um, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a big problem for people making religious claims, because virtually all of their claims are going to be appealing to the supernatural. And um, they're not going to be admissible under this particular scheme. So they could claim, for example, that there is evidence of miracles. Well, miracles don't conform to reality. Uh, there have been no confirmed miracles. There have been no confirmed cases of water being turned into wine, for example. There are just no confirmed cases in history. And so the stories in the Bible, for example, which are cited as evidence for miracles, well, first of all, they can be debunked on two bases. One is that they're just stories; they're not confirmed, and secondly, they don't conform to universally accepted reality, because miracles just don't happen. There have been no confirmed miracles. So, just sort of coming on from that, I would say that evidence has got to be, of course, plausible and probable. And again, with supernatural claims, I don't really see how any of the religious claims are going to be, or rather, the evidence presented is going to be plausible and probable. So, for example, the evidence that a fatal illness suddenly cleared, and this is evidence for prayer, the success of prayer. God cured my illness. It's neither plausible or probable, because it's appealing to an agent for which there's no evidence. So you can't really say that it's either plausible or probable. So moving on, I should say that if there's evidence for a claim, which contradicting it, in order to contradict it, you would have to appeal to absurdity and extremely improbable defeaters. So if you've got evidence for a claim, and for example, with my thermometers, if we've tested it 100 times with different thermometers, and they all say 100, it would be absurd, and you would have to appeal to something which is extremely improbable in order to defeat it and debunk it as a piece of evidence, because it seems incredibly unlikely and improbable that, for example, 100 different factories would all make a thermometer which would read 100 when the water boils, and absurd as well to claim such a thing. So I don't know what you think of those particular criteria. I'm just throwing them out there. It's not exhaustive, but I think what I'm really trying to do is explain my bafflement. Why we've got different standards, why there are different standards for evidence. It seems to me that skeptics and atheists have got a much higher bar for what constitutes evidence for a claim than Christians and theists. And of course, I can understand why this is, because some years ago, somebody called into the atheist experience, and I think he was a Muslim. And he kept repeating time and time again, no matter how many times Matt and Don pointed out to him that his claims were irrational and that there was no evidence for them. He kept repeating something which it's only now kind of sunk into me what he was talking about. He kept saying it's a matter of perspective. Every time they debunked his so-called evidence, For example, you know, he was appealing to intelligent design. You know, the nature of the complexity of nature is evidence for God. And then, of course, they said, well, no, we've got evolution, we've got science to explain all that. And he kept saying, it's a matter of perspective, it's a matter of perspective. And he kept repeating this. And the host didn't really seem to know what he was talking about. They were sort of saying, well, no, it's not really perspective, because evidence stands or falls on its own merits or weaknesses, regardless of your perspective. Something which I think is true. And it has to be, really. Evidence has got to be objective, and it's got to be objectively evaluated along the lines I've already suggested, but it isn't. And it's not truly objectively evaluated by, I think, mainly theists, Christians in particular, because, and I'm not saying that atheists always objectively evaluate evidence. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't correctly evaluate it because they've got a bias. I don't believe in God, and there are times when I listen to evidence which has been probably not perfectly presented, for example, for evolution and other things. And maybe I could be a bit more critical sometimes of that evidence because I've got my own perspective, and my perspective is I don't believe in God. Okay, I don't believe in God because there's no evidence, but still I carry that around with me. Christians and theists start from a position. They're believers. They go out looking for so-called evidence which will support their claims. They've got, I think, more so than atheists, because, of course, atheists are just rejecting a belief in God, whereas Christians are actually affirming that something does exist. So I think that they're much more prone to this confirmation bias, whereby they will accept evidence of a much lower standard. In fact, no evidence at all, as I read out that there's no good evidence or bad evidence, there's only evidence. They will accept, they will look for the highest possible standard of evidence that they can find. And in reality, it's still falling well short of what is real evidence, because every time it's presented, it always falls short. We can always defeat it along the lines of the criteria which I read out earlier, that it's improbable, it does not conform to reality, and it can be defeated without appealing to absurdities and improbabilities. So I don't want to go on too much more, because I think I've articulated my case sufficiently and explained what I think is evidence. Forget good evidence, bad evidence. No, just evidence. We need evidence, and evidence will necessarily establish that a proposition is true. And if it's not evidence, then it won't establish that that proposition is true. So I'd like to say that, in my opinion, the reason that on the atheist experience we're hearing the same old arguments, but not arguments, we're hearing arguments and we're hearing evidence. The two are not really the same. There are arguments for the existence of God, and this is something that I'm going to talk about on another video, that on existential claims, it seems to me that there's only one so-called entity that anybody ever tries to make an argument for the existence of, and that's God. Nobody ever tries to construct a philosophical argument for the existence of Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, only God. So that's a topic for another time. But I think this is the problem, that over the years we've heard the same evidence presented, and I've listened to hundreds of episodes of the Atheist Experience, and there's only maybe, I don't know, I mean, you could almost say there's only a dozen different so-called evidences. Most of it is the Bible, intelligent design, and it's the same old thing, time and time again. And Christians come on with these well-worn pieces of so-called evidence, almost like they're the first people that have been on with this, expecting to surprise the host and convert them. It's actually quite laughable. And I think that we need to be clearer when we're explaining to Christians why this is not admissible as evidence and what constitutes evidence along the lines of what I've already discussed, the criteria that I've set out. I think that we need to be a lot clearer about what we consider evidence, because we've often been asked, what kind of evidence are you looking for in order to accept the proposition as true that God exists? And I personally don't know, and I don't think that's my job. But I know that according to the criteria which I've set out, I don't really see how it's possible to actually present such evidence at all, because we're talking about the existence of a supernatural being, the creator and the master of the universe, who is not detectable by any means, it seems, and remains hidden. And I don't really know what kind of evidence I would accept, because even if, I don't know, I mean, even if something appeared in the sky, or even if the planets changed in the solar system and there was some amazing signal coming from space claiming that I'm the Almighty God and I've changed the order of the planets or something like that. Well, I suppose that would be, if the planets really change position, it wouldn't be conclusive, but it would be fairly impressive. But still, it would not constitute evidence, in my opinion, because it still would not satisfy all the criteria which I've laid out. It would not conform to universally accepted reality, because we know that the planets can't change position. And well, I suppose in that sense, if scientists and astronomers actually concluded that the planets had changed position in the solar system, while it would not be evidence for the existence of God, it would be like a start. It would be so impressive that me, as an atheist, I would have to seriously consider that as some kind of evidence, particularly if signals were coming in from space. But it could have always happened by another means. There may actually be aliens who have got that power and could have done that and could be sending the signal. So there's a defeater. And I would not say it's an implausible defeater for such an absurd scenario. And I apologize for presenting it that way. But I couldn't really think of anything else that would be so amazingly impressive that it might make me think that God does exist. But even that can be defeated, because you could say that there are aliens out there who've got amazing powers, and this is something which has been made to happen within the material universe. And as we know, God is supernatural unless he intervenes to do it. But still, that evidence alone can still be defeated, because it is not necessarily God that's doing it. Okay, well, I feel like I've kept the conversation the discussion at quite a good level, maybe until the last 5 minutes. So I apologize for that, but it is a complex subject. And if you've got anything to add in terms of what constitutes evidence, how can we lay out a set of criteria? Do you agree with my criteria that I mentioned earlier? Do you think we could add any? And do you think it would be helpful to explain this to Christians and make them understand maybe why we're rejecting it? Because they really think that they've got evidence, good evidence. They think they've got evidence for the existence of God. And I think that my criteria are quite reasonable, and that it really discounts all the evidence that they've put in front of us so far. So, well, I'm going to leave it at that for now. And if you've got any comments to make, I'd be delighted to hear them, and even I'll respond to them. Goodbye for now.